Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we like to go deep into various theories of everything, ancient and modern, and try to slice and dice them, figure out, what these are all about, how to use them to our greatest advantage for formation of a holistic worldview, paradigm shifting, awakening to 5D consciousness, and so on. Today is our 548th video that we have done on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. And Mr. Larson is pretty much obscure, unknown, but he lived in the 20th century, died in 1990, did most of his work out in Portland, and there's some activity also in Salt Lake City. Larson wrote books on chemistry and physics and astronomy, but he also has a book on metaphysics with sections on philosophy, religion, psychology, biology, and he also has 2 books on economics. And we're looking at one of those 2 books today called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. Mr. Larson is a pioneer in terms of proposing a universe based on motion, not matter, not energy. But in Larson's world, the universe is made entirely of one component, motion, which exists in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. So for Larson, the universe is made out of motion. Other people have said that before. Rene Descartes, Thomas Hobbes. But Larson was able to make it work because he more specifically defined motion as the relationship between space and time. You can see that more basically with speed. The car was moving at 15 miles per hour, 15 miles of space in 1 hour of time. Space over time, speed. But Larson spread that out and applied it to all of our real scientific entities, scientific quantities like matter and energy and pressure and force and acceleration and momentum and power and electric charge and magnetic permeability and all of these other quantities. They are all fractions with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. Time and space can have multiple dimensions. So you can have relationships like matter, time to the 3rd power over space to the 3rd power. Force is time over space to the 2nd power. Acceleration is space over time to the 2nd power. Pressure is time over space to the 4th power. Density is time to the 3rd power over space to the 6th power. And so on and so forth. And also, when Larson is referring to motion, he's referring specifically to what he calls scalar motion. Scalar motion is a motion that has a magnitude but no specific direction. It's really like an internal motion or an inherent motion. It's a motion that is always there. It's always omnipresent and eternal. It's and you can envision it using something like a balloon, a bubble that you put dots on with a magic marker. If you blow up the balloon, all the dots are moving away from each other. Um, every dot is moving away from every other dot. And but there is no specific direction. You can't say that, you know, one dot is moving in a specific direction. They're all moving in every direction, away from every other dot. And if you contract that balloon, they will all be moving toward each other. That's a scalar motion, a motion with a magnitude but no specific direction. The outward, those are the two fundamental motions in Larson's system. The outward motion, Larson calls that the progression, and that progression is always occurring. And it's always occurring at a quantized rate of 1 unit of space per 1 unit of time, which is also known as the speed of light. And that is the source of all of everything in the universe. And it is harnessed by kind of reversing that motion, turning that outward motion of the balloon to the inward motion, which Larson refers to as gravitation, and which precedes matter. And so that's kind of how it works. Larson, when he originally, derived this reciprocal system, he didn't even refer to it as motion. He referred to it as space-time. Then he began to refer to it as motion. Later in his life, he actually continued to refer to it as motion, but he also mentioned it as change in 3 dimensions, kind of a more broad, conception of motion as change in 3 dimensions. And for me, as a historian, history is generally defined as change over time. So what we're looking at with history is we're looking at a change, which is motion, which is space over time, and then we're going over time again. So space over time, which is acceleration, space over time to the 2nd power. I dropped the ball out of the window and it fell at 9.8 meters per second. And so, history is acceleration. And that perhaps is why history repeats itself. And it doesn't necessarily repeat itself as much as it rhymes. And it also, if you look at like Terence McKenna, or what he talks about with the time wave, that history is accelerating. Every new loop, every new repeat of the history recurs more quickly. Less time in between the recurrence of history, to the point where eventually it's repeating so fast that it came up to what he calls a eschaton or something like that. Just, musings more for me to think about, or maybe, if you're a historian or anything, you might. But we're looking at his book on one of his books on economics today, The Road to Permanent Prosperity. We're in toward the end of chapter 12 on money inflation. So Larson applies these concepts to economics. And, first he is, cutting against the general consensus of sociological economics, where you have a point of view that you're trying to, grind into your economic outlook. Larson is really saying economics is a science like everything else, and you have to build your economic system based on physics. It has to comply with the facts. Otherwise, your system is going to collapse. The main fact is, produce or die, work or starve. You have to produce something to have an economic system. And, there's a lot of economic systems that are out there that are based on, higher wages, raise the minimum wage, or make work. Just put them to work. Doesn't matter whether it's productive or not. you know, and Larson calls these various schemes something for nothing schemes. And if you have a something for nothing scheme, that means that you also have somebody who is giving something and getting nothing. You know, the something for nothing schemes can work on a local level. You know, one person at a time might be able to benefit, but as far as the economy as a whole, you have a large group of people then that are getting nothing for something. And so Larson and then Larson finds that the reciprocal relationship that is analogous to space and time in the economic system is production and consumption. And, you know, you produce goods, and those goods become purchasing power for the producer. They become articles of consumption for the consumer. And so those are the two core items. Larson arrives at a number of different principles and that he contends are scientifically, mathematically exact, and arrives at a flowchart for how the economic system operates. He starts with the, you know, the Robinson Crusoe situation, which evolves eventually, you know, the desert island, one person on a deserted island, then eventually to barter, then eventually to money, then eventually to employees, and the modern economic system. And so he, you know, arrives at a flowchart about how things work and points out a lot of things that, you know, your basic mainstream economists they're doing that are just Larson lays bare that they are absurd. He'll be talking about that more in this chapter, I believe, starting with the Say's law. And so we're going to get started right now and see if we can get this chapter finished. If you want to get any more info on the reciprocal system, you want to watch one of my first 474 videos on this topic. I go into the reciprocal system a little deeper. If you want to go back about a month worth to start the beginning of this book, you know, if you want to go from the start. But right now, we're going to be toward the end of chapter 12. Say's law specified in the clearest terms that this could not occur, a shortage of demand. The simple-minded belief in Say's law that held overproduction to be impossible. Those are quotes from other authors. And now we're at Larson. The truth is that Say's law has nothing to do with any of these items, either as Say originally formulated it or in the modified form in which it is employed in this work. That's principle 3. It is not concerned with the demand for money or with employment or with overproduction or with the lack of demand or with an equilibrium between individual prices. What it says is that production of goods automatically creates the exact amount of purchasing power necessary to buy those goods because the goods themselves are the purchasing power. The statement that supply creates its own demand is a correct expression of Say's law if it is properly interpreted, but unfortunately it is too often misunderstood. So supply creates its own demand is Larson's interpretation. There is a somewhat general impression that the statement means that the act of producing goods automatically ensures the availability of enough buying power to purchase these goods in the markets at prices equivalent to the cost of production. The latter term being understood to mean the actual payments made by the producer for labor and the services of capital, including some return to the owners of the equity of capital. While our findings indicate that in the long run this is true for the aggregate, it is quite evident, both in theory and in practice, that it is not true over shorter intervals, nor does it hold good in each individual case. This discrepancy has contributed materially to the existing distrust of Say's law. The source of the difficulty can easily be located by looking at the purchasing power creation from a value standpoint. Since the goods are the purchasing power, the value of these goods, as determined by sale in the markets, is the amount of purchasing power in terms of money that has been created, and this is the amount that the producer receives if the economy is operating without reservoir effects. If, through miscalculation, the producer has paid out more to the suppliers of capital, the suppliers of labor and capital services than the value of goods, Say's law does not assure him that he will get his money back. It merely brings back to him the money equivalent of the value of the goods produced. It was mentioned in Chapter 11 that one of the reasons for using the term production price rather than cost of production was to prevent that quantity, as it is used in this work, from being confused with the cost of production as defined in other ways. The case now under consideration shows why this is necessary. Since the production price, as defined for the purposes of our analysis, includes the actual profits of the owners of the enterprise, even where these profits are negative. If an item is produced at an incremental cost of $3 and sold for $2, the profit is minus $1. That's a loss of $1, and the production price, as we have defined it, is $2. Say's law, as defined in this work, tells us that inasmuch as it's, I'm sorry, all the spaces are gone here for the next couple lines. Inasmuch as an item worth $2 at the current normal price level was produced, the suppliers of labor and capital services, including the owners of the enterprise, will, in the absence of reservoir transactions, get a net total of $2 with which to buy this item, the exact amount needed for the purchase. Here we have another illustration of the principle that the economic situation as a whole is governed by factors which are quite distinct and often very different from those applicable to the individual items that make up the whole. In the production of an individual item, Say's law gives us no indication of how the producer will fare. He may lose all that he has put into the production process, or he may profit handsomely. In this case, the profit component of the production price is indeterminate until the goods are sold. Consequently, the production price in total is not fully determined until after the goods market transaction has taken place. Say's law is just as valid as ever. That is, the act of production creates the exact amount of purchasing power necessary to buy the goods produced. But we cannot define the amount of purchasing power in terms of money at the production end of the system. In the modern economy, where the exchange transactions are handled through the medium of money, the law is therefore of little assistance in dealing with the production and marketing of individual items. But in the general situation, the average rate of profit is essentially fixed. It cannot fall appreciably below the interest rate because the suppliers of capital will divert the capital elsewhere if earnings are too low. It cannot rise appreciably above the interest rate because of the competition between the capital suppliers. Inasmuch as all other components of production price are fixed by actual payments to the suppliers of capital and the services of outside capital, this means that for the economy as a whole, production price is determined in the production market. Say's law, Principle 3, then tells us that this same amount is available as purchasing power in the goods markets, unless the equilibrium is upset by what we have called a reservoir transaction. Under normal market conditions, therefore, producers as a whole will be able to sell their products for the full production price, including normal earnings on their own invested capital. The part that the goods markets play in this process is to establish relative values and thus allocate the total purchasing power among the various items making up the total goods flow. The average producer gets a return which enables him to earn a profit equal to the current interest rate. The enterprise which, in the judgment of the marketplace, has been able to produce above average values from the labor and capital services that it has utilized receives more than the average share of the market proceeds. The one which produces less than the average receives less. This is strictly in accord with Say's law, because the larger or smaller returns to the producers are exactly matched, in the absence of any net reservoir transactions, by higher or lower prices paid by the consumers. In each case, the amount received by the seller is the amount paid by the buyer. In turning their backs on Say's law and adopting the autonomous demand concept, the socio-economists of the present day have undoubtedly been influenced to a considerable degree by their sociological bias. Since an explanation which attributes our inability to buy as much as we would like to a lack of money or of purchasing power in general rather than to the inadequacy of our production is much more palatable to laymen and economists alike. Schemes to distribute more money to consumers in one way or another are also more popular than measures which involve working harder or putting in longer hours. But it is probable that the economists' exaggerated opinion of the importance and the capabilities of the laws of supply and demand has been an even more potent factor. In their proper field of application, the supply and demand principles have been an outstanding success in a branch of knowledge which is, in general, distinguished more by its failures and shortcomings than by its successes. And under the circumstances, it is only natural that the extent of the successes should be overestimated. The truth is that along with the successful applications of supply and demand theory, there have been many misapplications. The principles of supply and demand have been applied to problems to which they have no relevance, and this has contributed greatly to the confusion that now exists in several economic areas, particularly such subjects as the origin and magnitude of the total demand for goods and the true significance of the money supply. As brought out in the preceding pages, the total demand for goods, in the sense in which this term is used in economics, is determined by production, with only limited and temporary modifications by reason of reservoir transaction. The concept of an autonomous demand, determined independently of supply, analogous to the demand for wheat and the demand for shoes, is therefore entirely without substance, and the usual supply and demand analysis is wholly inapplicable to goods in general. A typical example of erroneous application of supply and demand reasoning is provided by Hanson's statement, quoted earlier in this chapter, that the demand for goods at the close of World War II was abnormally high because of the shortages resulting from the restrictions on the production of consumer goods that were in effect during the war years. So far as goods in general are concerned, this statement is erroneous. The demand for automobiles and for nylon hose was high for this reason, to be sure, but the abnormally high demand for these commodities was made possible only by giving them preference over other goods and diverting to their purchase as much as necessary of the total available purchasing power. The demand for individual commodities is essentially autonomous because of this ability to buy more of one commodity and less of another. But the demand for goods in general, in the sense that demand has an economic significance, cannot exceed the total available real purchasing power irrespective of whatever shortages may exist. The demand level that prevailed immediately after the war was not abnormally high in terms of real purchasing power. It was high only in monetary terms. This demand was not due to depleted stocks of consumer goods, as Hanson and his colleagues deduced from their supply and demand theories, but to the existence of large amounts of government-created credit instruments which were available for use as money purchasing power. That is, the money purchasing power created by production was being swelled by heavy withdrawals from the reservoirs. Real purchasing power was not altered. All that was accomplished was to change the relation between real purchasing power and money purchasing power. That is, to reduce the value of money. There is no necessary connection between consumer shortages and excess amounts of credit-created money purchasing power, and where one exists without the other, the excess money creates excess demand and causes inflation. Consumer shortages do not. This can easily be verified by a wealth of actual experience. Under circumstances where there has been no abnormal shortages of goods, credit measures similar to those utilized in the United States during World War II have been and are being utilized freely by governments which desire to provide themselves with purchasing power in excess of the amounts that it seems expedient to raise by taxation. This invariably generates excess monetary demand, leading to inflation. On the other hand, shortages of consumer goods likewise occur frequently, even chronically in some countries, but these shortages by and of themselves create neither demand nor inflation. The cause of excess demand in terms of money and money inflation is not the need for goods, but the use of money withdrawn from one of the money reservoirs to augment the normal flow of money purchasing power coming from production. What a nation does not have has no bearing whatever on the real economic demand for goods in general. It does affect the desire for goods, but desire without the ability to buy has no economic significance. The Chinese people probably desire consumer goods just as ardently as their American counterparts, but their economic demand is very much lower simply because this demand is determined by their production. An inflationary trend in the price of a single commodity or group of commodities may be overcome by an increase in the supply of these commodities in accordance with the recognized supply and demand principles. But an inflation of the general price level cannot be overcome by an increase in the supply of all goods. Additional production does not alter the inflationary unbalance, as the money purchasing power stream is augmented to exactly the same extent as the stream of goods, Principle 9, and the reservoir withdrawals which cause the inflation have the same effect as before. Except to the relatively minor extent that they may be counterbalanced by goods, reservoir transactions, net withdrawals from the money reservoirs always cause money inflation, and money inflation can never take place without such withdrawals. There is a common impression that inflation can only take place when production is close to the capacity of the existing labor force and existing capital facilities. Galbraith expresses this opinion in these words, quote, "Inflation, persistently rising prices, is obviously a phenomenon of comparatively high production. It can occur only when the demands of the economy are somewhat near the capacity of the plant and available labor force to supply them," end quote. From the points brought out in the preceding paragraphs, it should be evident that this viewpoint is completely wrong. Money withdrawals from the reservoirs and the accompanying money inflation can take place at any level of production. The same is true of wage increases or other increased production costs. What Galbraith and his colleagues are doing is confusing cause and effect. Money inflation results in an outflow of money purchasing power to the producers during the current period exceeding the outflow to the suppliers of labor and capital services. Except to the extent that wage increases become necessary or productivity decreases, the excess goes toward increasing profits. Productive operations are therefore abnormally profitable during the periods of money inflation, as the records clearly indicate. The natural result is that the producers expand their operations to take advantage of this situation. Thus, the correlation between inflation and a high rate of production does not have the significance that Galbraith is attaching to it. The high level of production is a result of money inflation, not a prerequisite for that type of inflation. Cost inflation has no effect on production volume as a whole, although it may have significant effects on that individual enterprise. As explained in Chapter 1, the essential characteristic of science, the feature that distinguishes it from all other branches of human endeavor, is that it restricts its scope to dealing with those items which are inherently factual in nature, and all of its activities are directed toward reaching conclusions that will meet the ultimate test of comparison with the observed and measured facts. In conformity with this policy, which we are here applying to the economic field, we have identified a variety of factual items that enter into economic life and have defined them with the precision necessary for factual treatment. For example, we have made the vital distinction between money and real purchasing power. With the benefit of this better understanding of the nature of the various economic factors, we have been able to recognize some important factual relationships of a fundamental nature. The conservation of purchasing power, for instance, that have been overlooked by previous investigators. On the foundation provided by these newly identified basic relations, we have begun the development of a confident, consistent, integrated structure of theory. This development will be extended further in the chapters that follow, but we have now arrived at the point in the analysis of the inflation phenomenon where we can subject some of the conclusions of this analysis to the kind of a test that is required in standard scientific practice. After the subject of cost inflation is discussed in the next chapter, Chapter 14 will utilize the results of observation to verify the entire chain of conclusions involved in the theoretical explanation of the business cycle. The theoretical sequence of events making up the cycle will be developed in detail, and the pattern thus derived will be compared with the observed pattern of events in booms and recessions to demonstrate how closely the theoretical analysis reproduces the observed events. Alrighty, that is the end of Chapter 12, Money Inflation. And Chapter 13 is called Cost Inflation. And we will start that chapter tomorrow when we resume. So thank you for tuning in today, and